different the women in wave one were from the women in wave two. Now, some historians, some researchers put what I'm considering wave one and wave two together and make it all wave one. You know, and then wave two, you get, you know, Betty Friedan, and you get Bella Abzug, and so on. So the division of the various waves can change with the book, with the researcher, and so on. Now, we're still going to talk about standing on the shoulders of the people that come before you. We talked about 6 on the bottom level. There are many, many more. Last week, we talked about Lucretia. We talked about Lucy Burns. We talked about Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Well, this week, we're going to be standing on their shoulders with a new group of women, very different. This group is going to be the bridge between the two groups, Carrie Chapman Catt. Then we're going to go to Alice Paul, 40 years in Ridgefield. And then we're going to be going to Lucy Burns, her counterpart, just like Susan and Elizabeth, we have Lucy and Alice. Then we have Elsie from Reading, and then we have the very wealthy woman, Ava. So what I'd like to do is talk about the women now and the differences. Oh, these women now were highly educated. Some had their master's, some had their doctor's degree. These women were still white. There was money in their particular backgrounds. Now, the last time we talked, the women, except for Susan B. Anthony, were all married. Now we have single women, divorced women, we have lesbian women. We have people who are working in the professions. And before, remember, the women weren't allowed to do this. They're a little less ladylike than the previous group of women. They were a little more militaristic. And in this group, you only have one Quaker, and that is Alice Paul. They tried new strategies. They had suffragette schools. They debated the antis. That Phyllis Schlafly, they took her on all the time. So anyway, I'd like to start with Carrie Chapman Catt. Now today I'm not dressed in yellow. I am dressed in sapphire blue. And the reason I am is I am honoring Carrie. This was her patriotic color when she was out getting the vote or when she was speaking. Now, her name Chapman was from her first husband who died of typhoid, and Catt was the name of her second husband. She was tapped by Susan B. Anthony. Remember, we said that all of these women had a link and a mentor to somebody before them. This woman, Carrie, is known for the League of Women Voters. She started it, she stayed with it. It was her lifeline, and today, the League of Women Voters is still so important. Now, right away, we find a difference. Where was she born? Not upstate New York, not New England. Wisconsin, farm town, Ripon, Wisconsin. 7 years old, she moves to Iowa. She's an Iowa farm girl. She sees her father going to vote. And she says to her mother, well, aren't you going to? And her mother says, women can't vote. And she goes, what? And it begins to come to her that there's a difference here between men and women. And she says to her father, I want to go to school and I want to be a doctor. And her father says, no, no. Women are not doctors. You're going to go to school and you're going to be a teacher. And she was, but she was also a principal. She was also the superintendent of schools for Mason City and the whole county-wide superintendent of schools, which was really a very big deal. Well, anyway, she got married for the first time, and this was right at the end of college. And in college, there were only 3 women in her class. She was the only one that graduated, and she didn't get to give the speech because women couldn't give the speech, even though they might be the valedictorian. However, many years later, they were looking for some sort of a distinguished commencement speaker, and they finally let Carrie be the first woman speaker. Well, when she married her husband, she moved to San Francisco, and she decided she would be a journalist because she was a great writer. She loved to write. And oh my goodness, sexual harassment. She was hit on by this man daily. And she said, "What is my recourse? There are no laws. There's nothing I can do. The only thing I can do is get the women's vote, get these laws, and make something happen." So she was really touched by her mother not voting and the sexual harassment. Well, she was tapped by Susan B. Anthony, and she started as president of NAWS. NAWS is the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She was a great speaker. She spoke at the important 1890 conference in Washington, D.C. She was such a great speaker that the Republican National Convention gave her a whole 10 minutes to speak. Democrats didn't want anybody to speak. Anyway, her husband died, and she decided to go back and then go to the East Coast. And then she started traveling and speaking out west. Now, the women out west got the vote. Wyoming, Colorado, Nevada, Idaho. Why did the women through their state get to vote while the women in the rest of the country didn't? It was marketing. They needed women. It was all men out there. So they said to the women, go west, find a man, get a husband, get a better paying job, and we'll even throw in the chance to vote. So she did a lot with that. Also, it was getting around the time now, around 1912. She was getting somewhat older, and she was very formal. She believed in ladylike, she believed in states getting the right to vote, then the federal government. She didn't want any violence, and she didn't want to hear anything about the ERA. And then 3 women come: Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, and later Elsie Hill. And boy, did this change everything. So I'm going to talk about that, but I wanted to continue, with her particular life. So Carrie, she went on speaking and all, and when the war came, she did what most people did, like in wave 1. She said, no, we're going to work on the war effort. I'm not going to do any speaking during this time. And she didn't. Meanwhile, Alice was chaining her group to the fence. So Carrie decided, instead, I'm going to go abroad. I need a rest. Well, she didn't rest. A person like Carrie never rests. She went abroad. She saw the need for suffragettes there. She started the International Women's Suffragette Association. She started a Pan Am Association to teach women how to be better voters. She got involved with the prison, the Black women, Jewish women, and then the League of Women Voters. She has been such a dedicated person. Well, when it came around the parade time, the 3 women came to Carrie and asked her. They said, we're part of NAWS. We have a plan. we would like to do this parade. Carrie looked at the plan. It was so well organized. She said, it's not going to be violent. They said, no, no, everything's going to be fine. We're taking care of everything. Well, the parade was great in the beginning, and then 200 were taken and arrested and taken to the police department. So that's when everything sort of stopped. The two groups, Carrie and Alice, split. It wasn't a terrible thing. They came together when they needed to come together. Then we come down to around, 1918, and Woodrow Wilson finally decides, after 2 terms, maybe these women should get the right to vote. I mean, Carrie has been all over the states out west are giving women the right to vote. Alice has had this huge parade where there were 100,000 people. People are still talking about it. Then we have the Silent Sentinels, and they are pinned to the White House gate, and Woodrow Wilson has to go by them every day. But the big thing is, during the war, these women were working. Our women were nurses and ambulance drivers. They were cryptographers. They were spies. They were interpreters. They were clerks. They were telephone operators. They worked in the canteens. It was time. Finally, Woodrow could no longer say, your time has not come. Be patient. And what it was found, one of the reasons that the votes were not going through was because of the liquor industry. They knew if the women got the right to vote, they would vote for prohibition. They didn't want that to happen. Also, the 14th Amendment gave voting rights to Black men and immigrant men, many who could not read and write. They would go to the polls, they would be shown where to put a mark, and they would be paid off, and that's how votes were collected for various people. So anyway, at this point, I wanted to bring in 2 women from Ridgefield, Alcott and Shields. Now, everything came down, if you've read the Women's Hour, to Tennessee. We needed 1 more vote. And the woman you see here is Alcott. Her property is where Casagmo was. And the other woman you're going to see is Shields. And Shields lived on the corner of Market and Main Street. And that beautiful big white house, 2 houses down from the community center is where she lived. These were wealthy, educated suffragettes from Main Street. One of the women in their group was too old to go, but was related to Warren G. Harding. And she said to these 2 women, I want you to go and see Warren G. Harding and get him to talk to Burns, because they're friends, that we need the vote. Now, in addition to doing that, I want you to go and see the mother of Burns. She lives near you. She was a suffragette. She would want her son to vote for women getting the 19th Amendment vote. So it's a little confusing, but if you watch the movie, you will see Burns, the 24-year-old senator, take the red carnation out of his jacket and put in a yellow one. So we don't know for sure if the suffragettes actually did what they wanted, but we did get the vote, and it is recorded history. The women from Main Street who helped in Tennessee. Well, the next woman we're going to talk about is Alice Paul. We have Lucy there. We're a little ahead because I wanted to talk about Alice first. Alice was like 40 years younger than Carrie. and she was a dynamo. Um, she saw her mother, again, go vote, not go vote, and her father go vote. Her father was a gentleman farmer. She came from Mount Laurel, New Jersey. Her father was also an amazing businessman. They were very wealthy, but she thought of herself as a farm girl. Again, the only Quaker. Her mother loved classical literature, read every book she could think of that was classical to her. And she took her to every suffragette meeting she could, even when she was in elementary school. Alice did not have heroes like Cinderella and Little Red Riding Hood and nursery rhymes. Her heroes were the Susan B. Anthonys, the Elizabeth Cady Stantons, the Lucretia Mott. She thrived on these people. She was first in her class in Friends School, a devout Quaker. When it was time for her to go to college, Swarthmore. Quaker school, one of the only two schools, Oberlin and Swarthmore, you could go to at that time. And she had relatives who founded Swarthmore College. Well, when she went to college, she decided, what am I going to major in? And she said, I know, biology. I don't know anything about biology. That's what I need to learn about. Now, also, when she was at Swarthmore, she did date. She was even engaged. Now, in the movie, it looks like she has a relationship, but she really didn't. She was so dedicated her whole life to the cause that she really never dated. Well, when she got to be a sophomore, one of her professors said, Alice, I don't think biology is where you belong. You love the law, you love history, you love human rights, civil rights. Why don't you go to this great program at Columbia University in social work? You'd be a great social worker. So Alice said, give it a try. Well, not did she only go for her master's in social work at Columbia, she continued. She got 2 law degrees and a doctorate. Every time she got a degree, it was in a different area so that she could speak eloquently and write eloquently on just about any topic. She liked being a social worker. It was okay. She did it for a couple of years. She wasn't able to help enough people, just a handful of families she was working with. And she was hearing and thinking about the Pankhursts. In London, the suffragettes there, they were so active and she could learn so much about marketing and volunteers and fundraising and parades and petition and speaking before legislatures. Well, she went, and she also learned suffragettes' ways, not suffragist ways. The women there were mostly strong factory workers. What were they doing? They were throwing bricks and stones and lighting fires and throwing bombs and being disruptive. Why? Because they got noticed. People would finally listen, hear to their speeches. They were constantly being put in the newspaper. Alice learned so much, but she never, being a Quaker, took part in any of these meetings. Anyway, while she was in London learning about the suffragette movement and how to be schooled in the various elements of it, she met somebody who had been thrown into prison with her. And this was Lucy Burns. Now, if you remember back to 1840, Lucretia Mott went to an abolitionist conference with her husband in London, and who does she run into? Elizabeth Caddy Stanton. Well, this is the same thing. Here's Alice from New Jersey in her early 20s, in prison in London, learning about the suffragettes. And she meets Lucy Burns from Brooklyn, who is there to learn about the suffragettes as well. And Lucy and Alice become the new Susan and Elizabeth. Now, Alice was a little tiny, very stern, not much fun, brilliant person. Lucy was a gregarious, outgoing, tall, freckle-faced, red-headed dynamo. When she spoke, everybody listened. And talk about smart like Alice. Well, while Alice was in Swarthmore in Columbia, she was at Vassar, and then she got her master's at Yale. But she went to Germany to learn linguistics, and she was at Oxford, and that's why she was in London. And while she was there, she got involved in this movement. So you can see the dynamics of these women again coming together. Very, very powerful. Lucy, strong Catholic girl. As I said, we see all kind of religion, all kind of education, and so on. Well, now I'm going to tell you about Elsie Hill, and then we'll talk about the parade and some of the other things. Elsie does not get enough press. Elsie is from Reading and Norwalk, right over the border, 70-acre road in Reading. Now, her grandfather was an Episcopal minister. He died early. Who takes over? Her grandmother was a well-known minister in the 1800s in Norwalk. Her father was very similar to Alice Paul's father. He was a Yale graduate. He had 4 businesses in Norwalk. He was a congressman. He believed that women were equal to men and should earn their own living and be listened to. Her mother, again, mother, why aren't you going to vote with father? Mother took her to all the suffragette meetings. Her mother was head of DAR in Connecticut. Elsie had 2 older sisters, Claire and Helena. They all went to Vassar and made a great name for themselves. Before they were in Vassar, they did something very interesting. They were theatrical. So they would go up and down the coastline in Connecticut and put on plays. Well, you can imagine what was the topic of these plays. The topic of the plays were women's rights. Women get the right to vote. They wrote some of their own plays, and others were published by other people. So they were ready to go when they got to Vassar. Elsie gets to Vassar, and she decides to start enfranchisement clubs. Remember, enfranchisement means getting the right to vote. She is so successful with her enfranchisement groups that she is asked to go to colleges all over the United States. But what really surprises her, she is asked to visit the Black colleges down south to help them start these groups as well. Now, when Elsie and her sisters graduated, the father said, you each get $1,000. $1,000 was a lot at that time. He wanted the daughters to go abroad. He wanted them to learn the culture, the language, to be independent, to be resourceful, and they did. So Elsie decided to go to France, and she came back, decided, I'm going to Washington, D.C. My father was in politics. I've watched him in the legislative bodies. I want to go to Washington, and I'm going to earn a living, so I'm going to be a French teacher. there it is. She goes to Carrie's Nos. She joins the group. She meets Alice. She meets Lucy. And they began to talk about this parade that Alice and Lucy had planned. Lucy had already planned and produced two wonderful parades in Scotland. So let's talk about the parade. When you watch the movie, The Iron-Jawed Angels, oh, you will really see what happened so much more clearly. Well, it was run by the three women, and they used Elsie to go all over the country, even down south to the blacks, round up people, get fundraising. They had 8,000 people marching in this parade. No one had seen anything like it. There were 100,000 spectators. This was such a big deal. It was the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. No one was at Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. They were all at this women's parade. Well, there was a big issue with getting the black women to come. And we've talked about this before, that some people said, let's get the white women to vote, and then we'll work on the black women. And, you know, should we invite them? Shouldn't we invite them? Where should we put the black women? Well, they finally decided, yes, the black women would be involved. The men would be on the sideline. They wouldn't be marching, but the black women would be at the back of the parade. Bad idea, they decided afterwards. I don't know if you remember me talking about Ida Wells, poet, journalist. And she said, I'm not back there with the blacks. After the parade started, she worked her way up right to the front of the parade and was very, very proud of herself. Now, leading the parade was Inez Mulholland. Oh, she was Lady Godiva with clothes on. She was gorgeous. She was brilliant. She was a lawyer. She was in the professional field. Unfortunately, before the women got the vote, she passed. She had a very serious illness. And you will see her in the parade in the movie along with Ida. After her, there were 4 elegant horse brigades. And then there were 6 amazing women's bands. And there were 26 floats. And then the women came marching in groups. The nurses in their academic garb, the teachers in their academic garb, the social workers, and so on. There were thousands of banners. There were so many placards. One of the banners came back to Ridgefield. It is now in the historical archives because it is so fragile. But Maria Pia Syrup and her group recreated it, and the last I know, that banner is hanging in the Ridgefield Library. This is such a precious artifact. Well, the parade was going quite well. We didn't think there was going to be a problem. Then they got in front of the White House. All hell broke loose. There weren't enough police. The police really didn't know what to do. They had never had a situation like this. The people broke through the ropes, mostly men. There was some women. They ripped off the sashes of the women. They threw tomatoes and rocks and raw eggs. They pushed them to the ground. They kicked them. They threw their hats into the air. They screamed and yelled. Oh my God, what a fiasco. This is what Carrie was hoping would never happen, and did. The paddy wagons were called, and 200 people were taken to various police stations. It was so quick, it was so fast, they couldn't really charge them directly. They did identify them, they gave them warrants for arrest, and they let them go. Well, was it successful? Some people say, oh my God, it was a tragedy. No. The Alice Paul group said, we put ourselves on the map. People know we are not going away. People know we are here to stay until we get the right to vote. It was so powerful. It really was. Well, as I said, after that, they went, Woodrow Wilson, they talked to him. No, 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 this is not time. We're not ready to give women the vote. He was always against women getting the right to vote. His wife was against getting the right to vote. Eventually, some of his daughters felt they should get the right to vote. So now, coming during the time of the war, Kerry sort of does not do as much. He works in war efforts. Now, Alice says, we're abroad. We're fighting for freedom. So I'm not stopping. We are going to fight for freedom right here for women. And Lucy says, you know, why don't we picket? Well, they did a little bit more than picket. They started the Silent Sentinels, and actually the Silent Sentinels were not all that silent. And they actually chained themselves to the fence of the White House. Whether it was snowing or raining, there was always a group. And why were they chained? Because they just didn't want to be, you know, pulled away. So therefore, they were brought up on charges like obstructing traffic and loitering and disturbing the peace and terrible things like that. And they wouldn't take the whole group. They would take a few at a time, put them in, send them, you know, for a month, 2 months, 3 months in there, depending how they behaved. If they got sickly, they'd throw them back out because they didn't want anybody to die on their watch. When you watch the movie, this is going to be hard for some of you to watch, but this is very true to what these women went through. They were raped, they were beaten, they slept on hay, on the floor with rats. The food had all sort of worms in it, and they would go on food strikes. And the worst part, the force feeding and what it did to their bodies, their faces, their whole being. It was unbelievable. And then they would chant, they would sing, they would do anything to make people understand what they were going through and sacrificing for the vote. And you will see in the movie where they take Lucy and they take her hands over her head on the cell gate and make her hang that way. And then the other women do it in unison along with her. These women were so supportive. These women shortened their lives and their health in many cases due to the Silent Sentinels. And as I said, finally, the vote came. And fortunately, with the Sentinels, the parade, the women out west, the women in the military, we finally got the vote. So what I wanted to talk about now is what happened after the vote. Well, Lucy said, I have had it. I have devoted so much time, effort to this cause. It was worth it. I have no more to give. I am done. She decided to go with Catholic Charities and help the orphans. Elsie did not give up. Alice lived till her 90s, and Elsie lived to her 70s, and both of them were fighting for ERA during the week of their death. That's how strong these two particular women were. Well, in 1923, Alice and Elsie's to-be husband, Albert Levitt, who was a lawyer at George Washington University, penned the Equal Rights Amendment, the Alice Paul Amendment. And you'll see Elsie didn't take her husband's last name, and this was getting to be typical now. Well, they penned the ERA amendment, and they presented it to Congress, and Congress accepted it and said, okay, this is great. You have until 1972 to get state ratification from 38 states. Never happened. So the government said, okay, we'll give you 10 more years till 1982. We were always 3 or 4 states short. And remember, when you're voting by states, they voted in, they rescinded. They voted in, they rescinded. So the right amount of votes has never been gotten. And what is the reason why? Oh, there's many reasons. Now, I don't know if you watch Mrs. America, if you watch the amazing Mrs. Maisel. Do you hear the word Phyllis Schlafly? Phyllis Schlafly was the most dynamic speaker. She influenced so many different people. Now, she seemed like she was Susie Homemaker. She was a shrewd lawyer. Oh, if you vote for the ERA, benefits, no Social Security, anything you get through your husband, gone. Also, you know, they're going to put you in the military. They're going to train you to shoot. They're going to put you on the front lines. If you get killed, who's going to take care of your children? And bathrooms. Oh, there's only going to be one bathroom. And you're going to have to, I mean, she went on and on. And there's still women today, even without Phyllis Schlafly, who don't believe in equal rights. And I understand that we all come from such different backgrounds. Well, Alice and Elsie kept plodding along, and Alice decided to become more involved in international issues. And she changed the preamble to the United Nations so that it was gender neutral. She went to Europe with the League of Nations. She got involved in the citizenship birthright, which you'll hear about next week. She did amazing things. Meanwhile, Elsie's doing the Bill of Rights. She's running every conference. She's before the legislative bodies. She's running for Congress 2 times herself. I mean, there was no stopping Elsie. In fact, she got divorced, not because she didn't love her husband or he didn't love her. She couldn't stop. She was never home, and he wanted a judgeship in the Virgin Islands. So anyway, they just kept the fight for the ERA. And I wanted to talk about, in 1940, Alice Ball came to Ridgefield, and she was here for 40 years about. And this is a picture of her house, her sister's house that she later had. It's on Branchville Road. It's right across from Briarwood, I think that's it, you know, Street. Bayberry Street, I think it is. You can't miss it. It's almost on the street. I've never seen a house as close to the street. It's a brown shingle house. It's got a flag hanging out over the street. In the back, there's a pond with canoes. And in back of that, there's like a bungalow. Now, her sister lived there and ran a church camp. And she said to Alice, because she was beginning to fail a little health-wise and all, she said, Alice, you have a cabin up in Vermont. It is not easy for you to get to Boston and Philly and New York and Washington and Europe. Stay with me. Alice stayed with her sister. It worked out well. When her sister passed, she left the house to her. And Alice was going to sell it for funding for the ERA. And Elsie, who lived less than half a mile away in Reading, said, no, 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 Alice, we're going to take this. We're going to build this into a leadership camp. You know, we need people who were passionate like we were. We're the old group now. We're like Carrie was. So now we need the young, passionate leaders. And they built this leadership camp, which was really quite successful. But in her 80s, Alice was really failing. And so therefore she had to go to a nursing home. And she went to Altna-Craig, which was on High Ridge. It's no longer there, burned down due to a suspicious fire. And there's just, you know, another mega mansion there. But you're going to hear next week all about Elsie and Altna-Craig and the impact that she still had in her 80s and 90s. Let me go now, though, to Elsie and what happened to Elsie. Elsie did 3 things that I think are so important for us to realize. You know, first of all, this was important to her because of Norwalk. I don't know if you've seen the Stepford Wives, but you see the Lockwood Matthews mansion. It was this absolutely phenomenal mansion in Norwalk. It went to wreck and ruin. There was no funding, there was no sponsorship, there was nothing. And this broke Elsie's heart. She was one of the lead fundraisers. She had it reconstructed. It is absolutely beautiful today. This was something outside of ERA that she did. Now, she also did this, which is so important. She lobbied the book companies. She did this research. She found that the book companies, the text was 17% about women and the rest about men. And she went to the companies and said, we're 50% of the population. We get 17% in the textbook. Come on, you are missing. And she just went all like these names we're talking about now. Do you know some of these names? Maybe not. They were not in your textbooks. Then she went to the colleges and she said, oh my goodness, you have history courses, specialized history courses in every area possible. Where are your women's studies, your women's history courses? I don't think today there is a college anywhere, a university that does not have women's study courses and majors in this particular area. So Elsie did so much to maintain ERA and what is happening there. And while I have time, I wanted to talk about one more person, if possible, and this is Elva Belmont. And then I'm going to ask questions. You can ask questions of me. I'm not going to ask the questions. Okay, Elva Belmont, very wealthy Southern woman, and she marries Cornelius Vanderbilt. Now she's got more money. And Cornelius's grandson has an affair. So the settlement she gets, unbelievable. She's got even more money. Then she marries Mr. Belmont, who is also extremely wealthy. I mean, this woman, we say rolling in dough. She loves architecture. She builds 6 magnificent mansions all over the United States. But then she gets a little bored with what's happening. You know, so many parties, so many luncheons, so much theater, so much fundraising, traveling to all of her homes. You know, she said, what am I really doing? So she builds a hospital and works with the people in Hempstead, Long Island. She starts going to the prisons and doing educational programs. Excuse me. She works with the garment industry. She works with women's labor unions, and she joins the National Women's Party, which is Alice Paul and that group. She becomes president. They need headquarters. She gives them this beautiful mansion in New York City, and she gives them another one in Washington, D.C. If you look at the movie, you will see that when Alice and Lucy start out, oh my goodness, it is like a storefront that is the worst place you can imagine. It is totally falling apart. And then later on in the movie, there's this beautiful mansion, and that's their headquarters. And that is because of this woman, Alva Belmont. Now you'll see it says the Seawall Belmont House. This is no longer a headquarters. 3 years ago, this building on Constitution Avenue was turned into a museum. You should really go. You will see Susan B. Anthony's desk. You'll see all the paraphernalia from the parades and from the Silent Sentinels. And it is really, really worth visiting. So these are some of the women that we are going to have on our next level. And I wanted to say, Lucy has a home, and you will get this in a handout this week. Hers is in Virginia. And it is a workspace art center as well, which was made out of a prison, because that's what Lucy would have wanted. Carrie in Ames, Iowa, has a building, the Carrie Chapman Auditorium for Women's Rights, and then has the whole building. Ava has this museum, the Ava Belmont. Alice, you can go to Paulsville in Mount Laurel. This is her leadership center, her museum, her family home. All the land isn't there, but you can still go to the house. You can still see so much about Alice as Seneca Falls as well. And then we have Elsie, and Elsie has the Rock House. This is on 70 Acre Lane in Reading, and I'm working with the Mark Twain Society to get small group tours of this house. After Elsie died, her daughter lived there, then her grandson. Then it was purchased by two women who adored Elsie, have kept it as a museum, love to talk about her, and are going to start giving tours. At this point, would anyone like to ask any questions?
Thank you, Darla. Good evening, everyone. This is Catherine from the Historical Society. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A screen at the bottom, and I'll read them out for Darla. Darla, so we have a question from Maureen. In the parade, were any of the attacking men arrested or only women marchers?
Oh no, it was a mix, and that's why they just herded people. You know, if they were on the ground or bleeding or, you know what I mean? They just put people in paddy wagons, and it was so much turmoil going on, both sides. And they did record which side they were on and their name and all, and they let them go basically with a warning.
Great, thank you. Anyone else with a question? So we have a comment from Suzanne. Please tell us more about Alice Paul in Ridgefield. For example, she formed a contingent that went to see President Wilson to convince him to support women's suffrage.
She did what?
She says, for example,
because,
yeah.
Okay, well, let me say this. Okay, the reason I didn't say a great deal about Alice is next week, you are going to have the entire session. You're not going to listen to me. You are going to hear Debbie Ali. And Debbie Ali was the private duty nursing aide for Alice for several years at Alton-Craig. And she was like her best friend, knows her well. She will be talking. But to answer that question more fully, we have Josette Williams. And Josette Williams is a historian, an amazing historian. She interviewed her, the last interview she had. They would not let people into Alton-Craig to see her. She was a very, very private person, and she will talk about the laws and regulations next week. You know, that will definitely be covered, and you will get a handout from Josette that will give you a timeline of Alice and focus on her 40 years here in Ridgefield. She was not somebody who had anything to do in town. You know, you wouldn't see her shopping in town or going to church or, you know, anything like that. She was extremely private, and that's why so many people don't even realize she lived in Ridgefield. And it's interesting because Rudy Marconi on her birthday in January gives his state of the town address every year to honor her and to give some sort of recognition to her.
Great. We have a question from Mary. How did you first become interested in women's studies?
I became interested later in life because I reflected on I'm 82 years old. There were so many things that I had been denied, and I wanted to know why, just like these girls that we've talked about said to their mother, why aren't you going to vote with daddy? You know, it was the same thing for me, like, why can't I get a credit card and my husband can? You know, why can't my pay in the school system be used as part of my mortgage? They wouldn't count it. I mean, I was discriminated against. I tried to get into Toastmasters. It was, you know, all male. I mean, there were so many things in my life that I was denied, that I wanted to be able to understand the women and fight for them, because I don't think young women today realize, until they see a movie like The Iron-Jawed Angels or hear people talk or read The Hour, what these women went through. I'm sorry, I get so passionate. Okay.
And I think we'll just take this last question from
Okay.
Dorothy. The ERA seems to finally have enough states that ratified it. Is it too late to become an amendment now?
Okay, what is interesting, this year Virginia came in. Now remember, the Congress said, okay, 1982, you have to get it. They didn't have it. They were missing, I think, 3 states at that time. Now in, I think it was Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia that just came in. So we have enough, but the time limit is over. So therefore, you know, somebody has to make a law, an amendment, something to say we can update it, we can utilize these 3 states or something. But many people also say the ERA was written almost 100 years ago. It needs to be rewritten, and the vote needs to be up again. You know, we need to rethink this whole thing. And this year, because it was this big celebratory year, we were hoping that something like that was going to happen this year. And because of all the turmoil, no one was going to focus on women's rights. But I've always been proud of the fact that Connecticut was the 5th state to ratify ERA, and it did not rescind. And some states have their own state ERA. We do not have our own state ERA. So, I mean, there's so many elements to this, but my hope, like Elsie's hope and Alice's hope, is that someday we will have the Equal Rights Amendment or some sort of a new situation that covers what these women wanted.
And I think we can we've got 1 more minute, so just squeeze in this last question from Maureen. Why was Schlafly so against it, since she wasn't staying home taking care of her family? Seems very hypocritical.
Who was that?
So she was asking, why was Schlafly against it, since she wasn't staying home taking care of her family? That's the question.
She, I think she basically, believed in it, but she was the leader of that group. Remember, we talked about the antis. She was the anti-ERA. She was their spokesperson, their president, their leader, the one that they listened to. And sometimes our leaders don't always follow what they are preaching. And she was an excellent example of that.
Thank you, Darla. Well, that's all we have time for tonight.
Okay, thank you.
So thanks everyone for joining. Have a good evening, and we'll see you next week.